Good afternoon. This is Aaron Purdue reporting to you from Coronado State Monument, just north of Albuquerque and Bernalillo, New Mexico. Today we're going to discuss the devolution of an ancient culture at what used to be part of an empire about 1,000 years ago. Now, this site was occupied until about 1600, and there were some environmental factors that contributed to the decline of this over time. However, there's some topics that I wanted to discuss on this because when the Spanish showed up, this culture was actually in a rebound, and had they not interfered in the way that they did, this culture probably would have reached another zenith. But pursuant to the discussions that have been had regarding the devolution of culture in modern times today, and what I like to call the Margaret Sanger factor, today we're going to discuss how certain interests, when they are trying to subjugate, eliminate, or subjugate and eliminate, or minimize a culture, can install interference and cause cultural changes that may, over the long term, cause the culture, barring external interferences or influences, self-destruct. Okay? So I am at Chihuahua Pueblo, which, if you go back and you read through the history, would actually make Albuquerque, or the Albuquerque metropolitan area, over 1,000 years old. The people who founded the communities originally in this area, and this being one of the largest of them, because it was located adjacent to a major river with 3 tributaries coming in immediately to the north, and on a major trade route, or the confluence of major trade routes or near the confluence of major trade routes that went all the way down into Central America, west to the west coast, north into Canada, and east all the way to the east coast. At the zenith of this civilization existed what we call the Chacoan Empire, Chacoan Empire. And this empire spanned from north central Mexico all the way up to what we call Wyoming, as far east as the Texas-New Mexico state line, and west to about the Colorado River, where it forms the state line currently between California and Arizona. The ancient cultures, or the ancient people groups in this empire, were, of course, the Puebloans of New Mexico, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Hohokam, which is the ancestors of the Tohono O'odham in Arizona, and the Yuma of Arizona and California, the Tarahumara, or the Mogollon, which now live in the mountains of northern Mexico, and some of their adjacent peoples. The Navajo and the Apache didn't arrive here in this region until about 50 to 100 years before the Spanish did. Okay. Quawa, which is the pueblo that we're at now, is, or was, shows evidence of a very large community here, possibly a city. The excavated part is very small, but if you were to stand out here and look at the mounds that surround the monument itself, you can tell that there were several structures here, or several plazas here. Of course, the two main plazas are the main communities, and the outliers are probably housed, some estimates are as low as 6,000 people. Some estimates are much higher, going into the tens of thousands of people. So Albuquerque, New Mexico is, of course, very old. We're immediately north of the core of the Metroplex, about I'd say about 18 miles north of downtown Albuquerque, and where the Spanish Villa of Albuquerque was founded in 1706. But as I said before, these communities were here first. Classical archaeology dates this site back to about the 11 to 1300s. Native American oral tradition dates this area 500 to 1,000 years. And in some respects, considering the Yakima about, 80 miles to my southwest, perhaps as far back as 3,000 years. This society reached its zenith, as I said before, about 1100 AD, somewhere between 9 and 1100 AD. And due to environmental factors, it declined and relocated and split up into the major river valleys of this region of the country, and then in the southern Rocky Mountains and the Colorado Plateau. Between 1100 and 1300, and when the Spaniards started coming up here in the 1500s, and we had the migration of the Dene, or the Athabascan peoples from the north, which would be the Navajo, the Ute, and the Apache, which also kind of slowed things down as far as a reemergence. And then the arrival of the Spanish in the 1500s. If you listen to the discussions of the ancients, and you listen to their oral stories, they had cities here. Now, they will tell you today that the Pueblo Indian culture here in this region of the world is a primarily matrilineal society. But later on in our talk, I'm just kind of wandering around the site. I'm actually close to the river now. Later on in our talk, I will intimate to you again, just like I did with the Yakima tale, as to why this isn't necessarily so. Shot here along the river. Got the mountains, a bit of snow up there. I'm probably going to get some more this weekend. So, as you can see, this is a pretty good site for settlement. Not only did these people have trade routes, but they had a fairly productive agricultural society as well. They didn't have, like we have, cattle and sheep in the domestic sense that we have in the modern day times. However, those mountains I just showed you a picture of, they were a source of Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, which, although a little bit wilder than domesticated sheep, would be a source of meat and wool. They did domesticate turkeys, wild chickens, possibly domesticated bison to some extent, or semi-domesticated them, and probably the sheep and the mountains as well. So I brought them down here, and so they had wool, they had beef, but as far as the agricultural setting, they had enough corn, squash, beans, tomatoes, chilies, nuts. Walnuts and pinon nuts are a big thing around here that they could source naturally and domesticate or import and then domesticate here locally, by which they could support a large population. So, very similar to what you would see with the Sumerians in the Middle East, Egypt, Rome, Mesoamerica. Now, there is some inkling of discussion that at the zenith of their civilization, they had road systems. And from space, some of these ancient road systems could be detected, which means that they probably had the wheel as well at one point. So they were on par, or close to par, with their contemporaries in the ancient worlds in other regions of the planet. So Asia, Europe, Southwest Asia, North Africa, and portions of sub-Saharan Africa. So what happened? Well, we already discussed the decline of their empire due to environmental changes. This area of the world gets a major drought every 1,000 to 1,200 years. We're kind of in one right now, where if you're in a more sustenance-based society, you're a little bit more susceptible to that. So these societies moved from the Colorado Plateau, where their center of the society was, which is now Chaco Canyon, and was at one point one of the largest cities on the planet. And of course they moved into areas like this where they had, during drought times, more reliable resources such as water in order to sustain themselves. And as the climate started returning back to normal in this region, of course it attracted other peoples before the Europeans arrived, and it became a little bit more competitive. And once the Spanish arrived, certain things happened to these cultures that are very similar to what I call the Margaret Sanger principle. A lot of what was done to these people was, of course, by force. Before the Spanish started bringing Africans, and the Spanish and the Portuguese were the first ones to bring the Africans over as slaves. Now, some what they call Moros, which would be Africans from Nubia and just south of the Saharan Desert, as part of the Islamic dynasties of the era, what Americans would probably have called freedmen. They brought those over, like San Esteban and others, but before African slaves were imported out here to this part of the world, the natives were enslaved. And In many of these Pueblo sites, you can see, or there still are, huge, massive mission churches that were built. And the Hispanic culture here oftentimes will kind of dilute the story a little bit because. But if you know how to read between the lines when you look at the written histories of these sites, you start to get the tone that when the Spaniards arrived and started putting down their haciendas, their plantations, and building their mission churches, that the labor that they used was forced labor. And some of the ancient and old haciendas here in New Mexico are in fact 400 and 500 years old. So you know for a fact that these plantations, Spanish plantations, and then later on Mexican plantations, were originally staffed by Native American slaves, and then later either augmented with or completely staffed with African slaves up until about the time of the founding of Mexico. So when the Spaniards first arrived here in the late 1500s, an example of what happened was the Yakima Massacre, where even though there was a civilization here in place, although it was kind of a remnant, a large remnant, but a remnant of an even greater civilization that was here before, and was probably, if they had not been interfered with, going to reach another zenith with the return of favorable conditions. These established cities and towns didn't care much for people coming in and essentially squatting. And they didn't much care for being forced to work for these people as well. And the Yakima, once the Spanish first arrived here with Coronado around 1530, and then missionaries came up here between 1530 and 1598. And then the first colonist arrived 1598, and there is a colonial history here ever since then. And the Spanish forced these people to build their churches, to build their plantations, their farms. And one of the ways that they did it is when when Oñate sent his nephew as his emissary out to some of these pueblos. One of them was Acoma, A-C-O-M-A. And I told this story once before, but the long and short of it is the Acoma resisted, and when it came to other pueblos, or Acoma and some other neighboring pueblos, afterwards, the men that survived, some say as young as 10, others say as young as 20, who were capable of making war, they literally, in many cases, cut off their right foot, hobbled them, or rounded them up and either sold them or just forced them into slavery. And because of that, here's where the matrilineal part comes in. The women that were left, some of them also were put into slavery, a good number of them, and they were put into slavery as domestics. We see a trend here developing. But those that were left, as well as the children, they kind of had to keep things going as best they could in spite of the situation. So there are 19 pueblos here in New Mexico. There's a few out in Arizona. There's some down in southwest Texas around El Paso. Some in Mexico still that are direct descendants of these people. So they still have a culture. It wasn't completely destroyed, but with the men being enslaved, put out in the fields, with their feet cut off, being literally hobbled. For the last 400 years, the traditional family and cultural structure of these people has changed. Well, how do you know it's changed? Well, I'm standing in the midst of what was a city, surrounded by what was fields and irrigation ditches at one time. And outside of draft animals, which there weren't many, there were probably a few, but not many. The only way to construct these things is with a strong back, predominantly of men. So that would indicate that at one point in time, there was most likely a patriarchal society in place of some sort. But as the men were quite literally neutered for the domination of their society and their culture, enslavement, perhaps genocide, and there's evidence of that as well. Smallpox blankets, anybody? The English weren't the only ones that used that. The Spanish were notorious for it as well. Kind of Tuskegee flavored, right? Yeah. So the women naturally had to take a little bit more ascendancy in the preservation of the culture. And now their culture is predominantly matrilineal over the last 400 to 500 years. And the condition of their people now is no longer that of a great warrior society. It's just not. So, kind of worn down. I read a quote by Margaret Sanger a while back about corrupting the culture of undesirable peoples in modern day America for their subjugation. And if you follow the train of thought of the Fabian socialists of the lost generation and the generation immediately preceding, and the antebellum generation, it's eugenics. And if you can't completely exterminate a culture, you subjugate it. But this whole thing about abortion or baby deletion and cultural corruption and the emasculation of men in a subculture or in a cultural class is not a new idea. It's not. and we look at some of what's going on very strongly in certain subcultures of American society today. But now it's beginning to spill over into other classes of American society today. And you can clearly see and draw some very strong similarities. Now, I'm going to pause here, just kind of flip the camera around so that way you can see the evidence of where I'm standing and what I'm talking about. And as I said, the excavated or the site, the area of the site that's open for the public to see is very small, and it gives very small examples of what was here. But I'm kind of close to a small section, at least here. Now you go out to Chaco Canyon or Salinas or other sites here in the state of these abandoned cities, and some of them are massive. But this is close by. This is where I could get the permission to do this without offending people or without potentially being disrespectful of other sites. So this is what I have to work with, but I'll just kind of pan the camera around here and that you see here. So this is kind of the example of what's left of a housing block. This particular block was probably 3 to 5 stories high. These bottom rooms would have been for food storage. And then the rooms above that for residences, shops, another place or other types of activities. There's the entrance building here. That's a modern building. And this clear area here would have been one of the plazas, and these circles in the ground here, and then that square over there, and that other square were actually worship complexes of interest. The ancient Pueblo religion was very close to ancient Mosaic Judaism in practice and in beliefs. A lot of people believe that Native Americans practiced animism. Some of them did. Some of them, such as the Aztecs, practiced a Babylonian type religion. But most actually practiced a monotheistic type of faith that assigned value to the various elements in creation, such as they would show respect and thanks for if they killed an animal. They would pray for rain, just like a Jew or Christian would today, or Muslim. So, a lot of parallels. I've always found it very interesting that 6,000 miles from the Middle East, and maybe a few hundred years behind them, maybe a couple thousand years behind them, some of the stuff was going on here, all the way on the other side of the planet, in a contemporary fashion. Now, you're going to see, you see the brush out there, but you're going to see these mounds here, which look fairly bare. And as we walk the site, there's a mound in front of me here. These mounds are undisturbed, but as you can see, there's kind of like squarish patterns in the mound themselves. These, of course, are all parts of what were buildings at one time. Some of them very tall buildings, very massive buildings. So, you can think of something comparable to maybe the Colosseum or maybe the temples in Mexico. Some of these structures, maybe not in this area, but in other areas, in large communities, especially at Salinas and Chaco Canyon, and up towards the Four Corners region, There's some more of these square mounds here. Not a lot of growth on them. Ground is fairly disturbed, and sometimes it takes a little while for it to grow back. But this clearing, I don't know. Let me see if I can pan in. There's some more cornerstones. Look back in the brush further back. There's a golf course back there, but you can see some of the undulating terrain. There's another mound right out there, kind of where the light spot is in the dead grass. That was probably another superstructure. Each one of these complexes, imagine if it's like a big apartment building. More stuff over there. Yeah, there was here. And just to the south of me is, Rio Rancho, Bernalillo. Up towards those mountains there is Placitas, and backside is, Moriarty, Cedar Crest. And further south of that is Albuquerque and Belen and Los Lunas and San Diego Pueblo, which is where the ancestors, or the descendants of what's left of the descendants of these people, which is only a few hundred. You can imagine this was a massive complex, so there were several thousand live on the reservation. I got another story about that, but actually we may actually go into that. There's another, here, I'll flip the camera around. It's kind of hard to delineate. Another kind of, you see the raised area out here on the other side of that fence. Another building there. Go even further out, up by those trees. See that raised area out there, right next to the golf course. And actually, part of the golf course was probably built over the top of it. Another set of mounds there. A depression. Actually, no. Another set of mounds there. If you look past there, there's kind of like a depression down in there. Series of mounds down in there. So that was probably another set of plazas, another set of buildings over there. There was probably stuff on the other side of the river as well. So yeah, I mean, Albuquerque's over 1,000 years old. Possibly, if you want to give credit where it's due, and really listen to the legends of the survivors, probably 3,000 years old at least. But what's going on with Margaret Sanger? There's a letter she wrote in 1939 to one of her peers that discusses almost exactly what happened to these people over time, through the Spanish era. What they want to do to black people, the surviving Native American people, Jewish people, people of Scots-Irish descent in, the poor rural areas of Appalachia, poor Hispanic people who live in these mountains here. The culture is actually pretty similar to those out in the Appalachians as far as how they live. But she really focused on the Negro. She had a hard-on for all of them. But she had a real hard-on for Negroes, Indians, Native Americans, Jewish people. So did her peers. She talks about corrupting the cultural leaders of these subcultures and using these cultural leaders over time, once they've been co-opted, to settle the matter or to rein in the more rebellious types. And who are the rebellious types? The strong people. The men, predominantly, yeah, and some women too, who would see BS for what it is and stand up against it, to denigrate their role in society. And what happens to a man when he doesn't have gainful employment or a gainful family around him? And he doesn't have a strong male-based mentorship directly in front of me. You see, a lot of this is compacted earth because of what was here before. And we've had a drought over the last couple of years, so yes, some of the did, and it's the middle of winter, but where you're seeing a lot of bare spots like this, there was probably something here. Okay. Raised spots. It's probably another, matter of fact, you can see the squares right here there. So there was a building here. And this one's about 200, 300 feet long, about 75 feet deep. So it was probably 4 or 5 stories tall. Disenfranchising the stronger portion of that culture first. Incentivizing the women to function outside of their traditional roles to complement of the more rebellious types. And then we can look, for instance, when the Egyptians, when they thought that a certain subset of their population in biblical times posed a threat to the elites of their time, or what they thought was a threat, or were undesirable, and that population became too large. In Moses' day, they were told to drown the male children in the river. Obviously, because they surgically couldn't go in and rip a child out, so that was their form of Planned Parenthood for that day. But there are tales of, I don't think the Spanish committed much in the way of baby deletion per se, but there's rumors of it. There's rumors of massacres happening during the Spanish colonial period where, during conflict, it wasn't just the men that were the victims of the conflict, but also the women and the children. So I'm not sure, because these people were a slave supplied to them, that they wanted to completely wipe them out. But they certainly did want to knock them down a few notches. And the Native Americans, although not as explicit as the African Americans, have also endured for 500 years, slavery. You could say that the reservation culture, which is still in existence today, is a very subtle form of Jim Crow, because they don't actually own that land. They don't. The federal government says that they can live there, and a lot of it is their traditional land. A lot of it is close to it. Others is just stuff that was allotted to them. Not always favorable, some of it is. But they don't own it. They can use it if they have permission, and the government can deny these permissions to farm, mine, whatever, at their whim. So they do that. They weren't given their voting rights fully until the 20th century. Their children were pulled away from them and put into schools. They were abused. Very similar story. But a lot of the same elements that happened to them are happening, or have been happening, to African Americans. But a key to that is, and I think the Spanish, even though it'll never come out and being admitted directly, was deliberate matrilineization and emasculation of the cultures. And Spanish people and Americans that came out here, and the Confederates, because this was part of the Confederacy too, I just kind of carried that stuff on. Coming up on another wall here. This one has not been excavated, but you can see of it. This is a very long structure. There's the river bank there, and there's a rise in the soil. It goes up over there. It cuts back over to the right, to the north. There's kind of a wash here, so a seasonal stream there. Probably a spring down in there somewhere close to the river. But this is a massive complex. Big city here at one time. I know. I use this man's name in vain all the time. But we got to give the man credit where it's due. You got people like Anger Man, who, and he again uses the entertainment hook to draw in his audience, and I think that's appropriate. Because frankly, my videos are more, okay, just straight out flat information discussion. I don't have much music or, attention grabbing materials. Partly because I'm just starting out, and partly because I just don't have it. And that's not yet my style. It may be in time, but it's just not yet my style yet. I'm more of a direct type of guy. And I think this is what he's talking about. Once the interference was injected into these cultures, it's almost like, in a way, what the barbarians did, or the effect that the barbarians had on the Romans. And actually the Greeks before them too. It's not written much about history because the Roman period lasted longer, but over time, as things devolved, culturally, and a lot of it was within the Roman system itself. Let's not deceive ourselves, because once a culture, and this is a kind of an indictment of the American culture and Western culture at large, and it's zenith right now, but a lot of it, as the corruption and the cultural deterioration happened, there was some bread and circuses, but, and I'm not quite sure, perhaps that was part of the fall of the Chacoan culture, the Chacoan Empire, and once the Spanish arrived, and once the Navajo and Apache arrived, that would be their version of the barbarians. Maybe the Chacoan culture reached their zenith and kind of fell apart like Rome. I'd have to listen a little bit more closely to native stories, and maybe there's a hint of that in there. Maybe there was some bread and circuses and it fell apart. There's some archaeologists and some Native Americans who are starting to talk a little bit about that, but it's just, I don't have enough of it to to really give evidence or to delve into that right now. And perhaps that's what happened in West Africa too. Because at one point in time, the richest man in the known world, while Europe was still in what we call their dark ages, there was a sub-Saharan, and sorry folks if I don't remember the man's name, I just know it existed. And maybe one of y'all can comment on this and tell me his name. It's just not coming to mind right now. There was a sub-Saharan culture that existed that was, at the time, the richest culture in the known world. And perhaps once they reached their zenith, it fell apart. And then when the Europeans arrived, they were kind of maybe at a tribal period of unsettlement or devolution, and chicanery could ensue because they just weren't in a space where they could fend that off where they would have been 200 or 300 years prior. And maybe the situation here was very similar. But the things that were done to these people and to African Americans, they kind of are very parallel in many ways. Only these people didn't have to be taken out of their continent. It's pretty much probably the only difference. And if you go, you don't even have to come out here to New Mexico. You can go to a Native American reservation nearest you and look at the condition of how those people live and their cultural condition. I wouldn't say first, but faster. And I think there are men like Anger Man who, for his general audience, and his audience doesn't just include African American people. I'm a white guy, I listen to him. A lot of what he says is very helpful to me. But at least for his African American and minority demographics, perhaps even for his Native American listeners too, I think sometimes he's really trying to sound a warning bell. And if you are Anger Man, here's some receipts for you, bud. Here's proof, not of African American culture or black culture, but another culture who either just before or right at or right when this is happening. Like I said, the only difference is these people didn't have to be taken off of their continent. And if you go look at their culture today, it's a mess. They're actually, of all the subsets of American culture, of all the sub-demographics, they're actually the worst off by a long ways. And they're further down the Margaret Sanger spectrum than even African Americans are, or the people in Appalachia. The Jewish people are such a minority in that their cultural cohesiveness being what it is, this isn't as affecting them as much. And there's probably reasons for that, but that's not pertinent to this discussion currently. But you go, Anger Man. I'm standing in the middle of a ruined city. Someone Margaret Sanger to these people a long time ago. Maybe we should take people like him a lot more seriously. Maybe so. It's pretty out here. Just a few moments of thought. Here's the evidence right here, guys. Here's the evidence right here. More mounds in front of me. This pathway drops off onto the banks of the river, and there's a wide spot down there. It's probably a place where they had a lot of their fields. It probably also had fields on the other side of the river. Hamus River tributary, where it comes in, is, I can't actually see the river itself, but I can see the cottonwoods alongside of it. About 1.5 miles ahead of me. Perfect. The gap in the mountains, I'll point it to you right here. So there's a gap in the mountains to the south. You can't see them because of this. Well, maybe you can. There's another gap down there. A gap here, a wide gap here. And then there's some more mountains on the other side of those trees over there. You can't see them there. So this is big city right here. Just like Albuquerque sitting on a transcontinental crossroad of the modern interstate system, and it's a large city today. And it's a major railhead. We know why, because of its ideal location. The original Albuquerque, this city here, had the same stuff going on. But now it's not here anymore. They got Margaret Sanger. They got Nathan Bedford Forested. They got Dred Scotted. The only difference is they didn't have to be pulled across an ocean, but the evidence of what they once were and what they now are is very clear. A lot of what was done to them, and after that, what was injected into them for them to do to themselves. Think about that. Really, really think about that. And instead of hating on people like Angry Man, who, at least in my estimation, is the strongest speaker on this forefront, and probably the most accurate, maybe we should listen to him. Maybe. I love all people. But I look at what's going on in society today, and it's absolutely crazy. And, it's happening to everybody now. But it just seems to be centered on certain subsets of American culture more so than others. And then, of course, it's bleeding over and spilling over into other places, and it's a mess. It really is a mess. And I could rage on the boomers and all that stuff, and they bought into a lot of these lies. But Margaret Sanger wasn't a boomer. She was a part of the lost generation. In the antebellum generation and before her, this deadly, deadly set of lies has been around ever since Adam and Eve. Eve bought into it. And these evil people know that that lie works. And they will use it any way that they can. And initially, yeah, it will give them some short-term gain for a few generations. But it always comes back to bite them. Because what they turn loose in the culture to destroy others ultimately comes to destroy them. Nobody wins. You know, now that I'm sitting or standing in the midst of this, one could wonder, even if the Spanish did come over, if they did things differently, how much better things might have been, or different. I know the track of history is what it is, and if you change the past, you irrevocably change the future. Not always for the good, but it does give one an instance to ponder. Not that I'm big on natural medicine or a big time hippie or anything like that, but there is some truth to that. You know that all the medicine we use is either comes from plants or is synthesized based upon phytochemicals. Well, I shouldn't say all, because now a lot of it is Frankenstein medicine, but up until recently, I'd say within the last 20 years. And, you know, sometimes when stuff like that happens, you wonder how much was lost. Some of these plants that are native out here have strong medicinal qualities. And I know what some of them are. But what if that technology hadn't been lost? Could we have cured cancer? You never know. Never know. But we need to heed the warnings of the cultural speakers today. And, yeah, that guy who likes to wear fitted caps and hoodies, maybe we shouldn't hate on him as much. Well, that's a nice deep spot there in the water. Too bad it's a state park, boy, because that's a good fishing spot. Oh, look, stumps in the water. Probably was a bridge there at one point. That's a deep hole there. Probably a lot of fish in there. Yet another reason why they probably put themselves here. A lot of stuff. It's beautiful. Across the sandbar over there, there's a big level spot before you get back to the tree line. And then another clearing back on the other side. It's abandoned now. Looks like it might have been a field at one time. Can't say. some of that's probably lost forever. So this is my little field trip. A lot to think about. Maybe we should give some serious consideration to the echoes of the past. So that way, some of us, many of us, don't make the same mistakes going forward into the future. And if we are, maybe we can pivot. And return to what works. This is Aaron Purdue, the AL-BINO, signing out. Y'all have a fantastic day.